of the southern Ozarks.
Hmm.
So I grew up with Ozark family, multi-generational Ozarker. My parents are from here, grandparents, great grandparents, all the way back pretty much to the early 1800s when Ozarkers sort of settled the land that was opened up during the Indian Removal Act. So before that they were a part of that. It's been a part of my life for forever. Growing up, I so it's been a part of my life for forever. Growing up, there were weird family stories and traditions that we passed around. At the time, I didn't really think anything was weird about it. It was just, sort of life and what I did. But I do remember thinking it was kind of weird that my friends, not all my friends had similar traditions. One that I always like talking about is the hoop snake. So the hoop snake is a Ozark fantastical creature. It's a snake that can bite its own tail and roll like a wagon wheel across the ground. And my grandpa used to say that if it catches up to you, it'll spit poison in your eyes. So this was kind of a story that people would tell, especially to kids that play out in the woods a
God,
lot. To
terrifying.
keep an yeah, to keep, well, it was kind of one of those things. Keep an eye on your surroundings. Make sure you know where you are, and make sure you don't get into trouble and all that. But it was there's other stories and things like that from my family that I didn't think anything of, but when I got out of high school and college, I took a folklore class and we read Vance Randolph, Ozark Magic and Folklore. And so Vance Randolph is probably the best known Ozark folklorist. He wrote mostly in the 30s and 40s. And his Ozark Magic and Folklore is what has been used amongst folklorists and practitioners for, since 47 when it was published. And so I found it, and, he was talking about the hoop snake. He talked about other healing traditions and things that I had in my family. I have a great Uncle Bill, who was a wart buyer. He could buy warts off of you. So usually like family reunions and stuff, when we saw him, if you had a wart, you'd go up and say, Uncle Bill, I got a wart. And he'd pull out a penny or a dime out of his pocket and he'd say, well, I'll buy it off of you. And so you knew to take the money. And when you took the money overnight, your warts would go away. So that was just,
Did it
kooky Uncle
work?
Bill.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Yeah, well, my family, my dad has stories about it working. My grandpa, it was his brother. He has stories about it working. If anyone had warts, they knew exactly who to go to.
Huh.
To go to Uncle Bill, and he'd buy them off of you. But when I was reading Vance Randolph, he mentions the wart buyers. He mentions wart charmers and these sort of magical cures, and amongst lots of other things. And so as I was reading this, this account, I something clicked in my mind. And I up until that point, I had never considered myself a part of a culture. I'd never considered myself this big tapestry of folk belief. And so from then, I started collecting my own stories because, Vance ran a tapestry of folk belief. And so from then, I started collecting my own stories because, Vance Randolph wrote collecting my own stories because, Vance Randolph wrote in the 40s. I wanted to know what has happened since then. Are
Right.
these folk practices still around? Are they dead? Where are we now in the Ozarks? So I started with family, collecting stories and as much as I could, and then I kind of branched out from there. I traveled around for a few years, just whenever I could, just collecting things from people here and there. And what ended up happening is I got a lot of really good stuff from regular people, home remedies, folk remedies, things like that. But then because I'm an Ozarker, because I'm a practitioner myself, I got the good stuff too. All of the ghost stories, the
Oh,
folk magic practices, the witch practices, all of these, sort of fringe beliefs that people have and, for centuries have kept secret amongst their families. And so as a practitioner, this book is really very different. It's not an academic work. It's not, like Vance Randolph's work. It's really from my own perspective and my own interaction with modern practitioners. So there's still this heart of folk practice, but it's changed a lot.
Well, one of the things that I appreciate you pointing out when it comes to looking at what Vance Randolph wrote was how old can't talk, old folks, folklorists would often use the word superstition
Right.
over and over as if, like, okay, I am academically researching this topic, but it's just they were superstitious, and it like
Right.
kind of demoting them a little bit for the beliefs they held. And I noticed that in my own research when I've looked up Michigan stuff, like they just superstitious people, like. And so I was happy that you pointed that out, because it is one of those things that when people revisit old folklore and sort of go, hey, I want to revive this, like what you did, you can kind of look at those biases that people used to write with and kind of give that a much needed update.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's been one of the most detrimental, things to Ozark folk culture and folk cultures across, the U.S. and the world. It's the stereotypes that are applied to it. So in the Ozarks, one of the reasons why a lot of the practices we have aren't around anymore is because people wanted to get away from the hillbilly stereotype.
Yeah.
They wanted to get away from that superstition, that they grew up with. And so by having folklorists, people that you kind of trust, to collect these stories and things like that, having folklorists use superstition or, hillbilly stereotypes, things like that, it's really detrimental to the culture. And I know, for me and my family, there's a reason why, I don't have as thick of an accent as my parents do, my grandparents, things like that.
Yeah.
Because even I, growing up, wanted to distance myself from that. And so one of the things that really drove me to continue my research, and especially with this book, is this: I wanted to be a representative of my culture. I wanted to approach it not as an outsider looking in, but as someone from within the culture, really wanting to not just revitalize the culture, because I think we're at a good time for that, but also to help validate the culture for others, the way that interactions had helped validate it for me.
It's funny, related but not related, that gets mentioned, and I've often said that because I have a lot of family from Tennessee, right? And there's a dialect down there, there's an accent down there, and I've often wondered, I mean, what, as far as like the hillbilly stereotype, right? Which we all know well, right? I wonder just why, and I guess, I mean, I may be answering my own question, because I've seen some pretty backwoods folk. I have relatives that are pretty backwoods folk, and they weren't educated people. They lived their own means, and they just weren't educated by our standards today, right? And I've always wondered, I guess the whole hillbilly stereotype, the first thing you think of is dumb.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, naturally, any person who, an intellectual, they're going to distance themselves from that. Of course. I mean, I 100% agree with that. But it's funny to think about that, because I wonder really where where it grew legs and just kind of went through time like that, where the hillbilly stereotype, when you think of people with that accent, and there's different even types of different accents within that accent, right? When you hear that, you automatically think, oh boy, low IQ alert.
I do feel bad for the Southern group, because I
and I'm not beating on anybody here at all. It was just a curious thing I thought of.
I've done that myself, where like you go to some mode, like I don't know, say something stupid, and you're like, oh, and you start doing like this Southern accent. I'm like, oh, it's bad, bad. There's extremely intelligent people.
You are not sensitive, Amber. You are not
Southern
sensitive.
accents, but there is that like wanting to remove yourself from that to like distance yourself, and it's just interesting.
Yeah.
The more you look into, just the dialect, especially in the Ozarks and Appalachians, so there's this huge Ozark Appalachian connection. The people that settled the Ozark Mountains came from Appalachia. It was hill folk traveling to highland areas. So we have this we're still considered a part of the greater Appalachian cultural region. But when you look at Appalachian hill folk dialects in general, a lot of it is based on Gaelic roots. So we're talking Irish Irish roots and Scottish roots. So a lot of the words that we use are sort of Americanizations of Gaelic words. And so, once I started looking into that, it changed the way I thought about my family. Some of the words that they use that I thought were just, not proper English. Well, there's a reason for that. And a lot of it has to do with the isolation of the families. And so, the story of the hillbilly, it's a really long and convoluted story, but, just in short, and this kind of goes into a lot of the hidden practices, the paranormal stuff, the magic stuff, is that, so the hill folk that came into the area, when you think about early settlement, people were coming to mountainous areas where you can't farm. You can't farm in these mountains. You can't, and a lot of times you can't raise livestock. You have cows breaking legs and stuff like that trying to get around. You have to get to some of these areas by mule or by donkey, things like that. So when you look at the families that voluntarily came to these mountain areas, they were crazy. They were crazy people in a lot of cases, and in a lot of the families, they sought out the isolation for very specific reasons, and in a lot of cases, it was to sort of chip away their own life, their own independence for them and their kids, their communities, things like that. But you also have a lot of people that sought isolation for what we might have to call spiritual reasons or mystical reasons. People that found a lot of power in the mountains and the otherworldly inhabitants of the mountains. And so these hill folk that settled in the area, later on, the farmers came into the valley areas after 30, 40 years. They came in after all the hill folk. And so you see this cross-culturally around the world between mountain people and quote unquote civilized people. You have the people in the valley who are, wealthy, they build up towns, things like that. And there's always a separation between the mountain folk and the valley folk. And usually, and if we look at the Ozarks, this is definitely the case. The valley folk, the people that in town, have always had these very weird beliefs about hill folk, specifically, that the hill folk are all witches, or that the hill folk can talk to birds is one of them that I collected, and that, the hill folk, they speak with the devil, and they, do strange rituals and things like that. So it's not just the uneducated stereotype, but it's also the not civilized stereotype. These people are wild. We don't know what they're going to do, so we need to fear them. We need to keep them where they are, and we need to keep them out of our civilized area. So in the Ozarks, this has really affected a lot of our folk beliefs, because a lot of the folk beliefs, the old practices, folk magic and healing, stuff like that, a lot of the good folk tales, the good songs, fiddle tunes, things like that, have been preserved not by the valley folk, not by townsfolk, but by hill folk, who have kept it as a part of their personal identity. And due to this sort of isolation in the mountains, they have, really grown these practices, evolved these practices.
That's fascinating. It's
well, there's a history for everything.
And for everything.
As you're saying this, I come to thought about that, and I'm like, well, yeah, my father's side of the family that I said are all from Tennessee. They originally migrated from Wales.
Yeah.
So it starts to make perfect sense when you think about it, that they weren't always in the same spot. And you said crazy, and people that are willing to go through those kind of means to get somewhere or take something somewhere. And I thought resilient also. Like
right.
I mean, you got to be crazy. I'm 100% behind you on that. You got to be a bit crazy to put up with that much to get somewhere, how difficult that work would be. But that's also just unbelievably resilient, too, as far as people. You don't make them tougher than that, really.
Absolutely. And that resilience is really reflected in a lot of the folk practices. Typically the healers that I've met, and certainly in my own practice, you don't buy things. It's a practice based on what you can gather off the land, what you can grow, or what you can find around the house. So, magical tools might include, an ordinary kitchen knife. That's used to magically cut illness off of a person, or a broom, just an ordinary broom used, with the idea that as you can sweep a house clean, you can sweep a person clean of hexes, of curses, things like that. And so this repurposing of household objects is a really big part of Ozark folk magic, because folk practices are all based in necessity. They're all based in a sense of survival. If you are out in the hills and you cut off a finger, what are you going to do? You don't have a doctor around. You might have somebody in your family that knows what to do, but in a lot of cases, families would have healers that they raised up within the family. A lot of times they were people with in positions of power, like the granny women, who were usually older ladies who had had lots of kids and were usually midwives, but then they also carried a lot of herbal knowledge, but then also they knew about spells and charms and things like that. So all of these practices were born out of necessity, born out of this sort of need for survival. And so that has always been, even now when we have so many different sort of pieces and things coming in from other traditions, we have the internet where we can buy whatever we need to, very specific things. The folk practice itself, one thing I like to encourage with people practicing in this way is to simplify things, to connect to this idea of simplicity in the practice, and see what you can repurpose, what you can gather sustainably off the land or grow yourself.
I think the whole damn world needs that at this point.
Oh, absolutely.
We really do. And I find myself getting into this conversation with people a lot, especially over the last, since the whole COVID thing. I know it's all slowing down now, but I mean, when the COVID thing was in full gear, I thought about just how different things were and how amazing it was. Dare I say, we were ordering a lot of things. I'm like, look, we can get grocery, we can get wherever we want here. All we gotta do is just go on our phone or our laptop and push a couple of buttons and let the credit card do its magic, and whammo, here's your thing in 24 hours or less, or whatever it might be. And you think about people in that era, in the old times, let's just say, and I think about that a lot. I'm like, man, that type of drama.
The internet where we can.
So, okay, if we don't grow food or we don't go out and shoot something, we starve to death. It's as simple as that. And I know it really is that simple. And I don't think people, just these kids these days, it ain't like that at all. But I think people, when it's so far back that we haven't experienced that in so long, people start to forget how things really were, and how people did live off the land, and how things were much more simple because they had to be simple. You had to conserve your energy. You had to do a lot of things to just simply survive and be resilient, right? And I think we may have answered this in a couple of ways here. Just given the beliefs and the practices, but you mentioned this, the paranormal itself, and maybe how, to hit the question directly on the nose, I guess, how Ozarkers, that's a hard thing for me to say. That's a hard thing for me to say. You've broke me, Brandon. Ozarkers, traditionally, how they look at things, of the paranormal. I know people, in our day and age, we kind of have a viewpoint. Everybody has their own viewpoint on the paranormal. I'm wondering, directly, what their view is of this stuff.
Well, and I'm curious too.
Because we talk about superstition and things like that.
Sure,
Right?
I'm curious about this too, because I feel like through going through Brandon's book, that there's a fine line that seems to be drawn with Ozark folk magic because of the influence of Christianity, and not wanting to be involved with witchcraft, and we're not doing that devil stuff. It just seems like there's a fine line that gets walked, and I could imagine that blends into any kind of paranormal belief as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Paranormal beliefs in general. We have to make a separation between the old Ozarks and the new Ozarks, I guess you could say. Really, the Ozarks started changing around the 50s, 60s with the Back to the Land movement. There was a lot of people coming in from California, East Coast, all over the West Coast. People that were vegetarian, people that were practicing yoga or Chinese traditional medicine, all of this stuff. They were kind of exposed to a lot of modern witchcraft traditions, like you were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
Wicca, things like that. So you have all of these people flocking into the Ozarks and butting up against this very conservative backwoods culture. And so after that point, at least in my own research, a lot of the practices have changed, the viewpoints have changed. But when we talk about the old Ozarks, the paranormal has always been a ever-present part of people's lives. But Ozarkers are weird about things like that. For one thing, a lot of people are more conservative, so they don't want to talk about it. But there's this notion in the Ozarks that you don't want to tempt fate. And what that means is, by talking about taboo subjects, you are risking somehow putting the universe out of balance. So, for instance, telling ghost stories around the campfire is one thing, but if you were to actually talk about a ghost that you saw, you run the risk of ghosts coming and appearing to you again. Or, by talking about magic, you run the risk of, God forbid, being born with a gift or having a child born with a gift. The sort of things you don't talk about in order to maintain this balance in the universe. But at the same time, underneath all of that, there is this very deep connection to the other world, to the world of spirits, things like that. So there's this very rich cosmology that we have that hasn't really been talked about because of this idea that you don't want to put the universe out of balance. And you kind of see that across other folk cultures as well. It's hidden very, very nicely behind conservative culture, though, because you have, conservative people that I've met who, on first encounter, they will say, "Oh, we don't believe in any of those superstitions. No, that's stuff in the past. All of this other stuff." They sort of hide a lot of their folk beliefs behind this sort of conservative outside. In one case, this lady that I met, she was a figure in her community. She was a praying granny, as they say. It was somebody that if you had any ailment or need, you could go to her, and she knew exactly the Bible verse to use. And so I got interested talking to her because that screams to me of folk magic. And so we got to talking, and she was a person that said, "Oh, I don't abide any of those superstitions, things like that." But we got to talking more and more. We kind of built up our trust a little bit. And then she started talking about the little people.
Oh.
So the little people are Ozark fairies. It's a mixture of European Celtic fairy lore that was brought into Appalachia and then mixed with indigenous lore about the little people. The Cherokee still call them the little people today. And so it's this weird amalgam, Americanized sort of amalgam, but it's been with us for centuries. So she started talking about the little people. And so I didn't bring up the fact that, this was kind of a not very conservative belief to have. But
Right.
certain holidays, she would leave food out for the little people because she didn't want to tempt fate. She never admitted that she believed in it, but all she said was that she didn't want to risk offending them by not leaving out food, especially on Christmas Eve. Not leaving out food that might, your house might burn down, you might have a flood come through, things like that. So, and her belief that, especially with the little people, that's not uncommon. There are a lot of people that, on the outside are these, people that would, be hillbillies or white trash or rednecks or whatever you want to call them on the outside.
Yeah.
But then they have these very complex beliefs on the, underneath that. The real, I guess, what's keeping all of this stuff hidden is this idea that there is this utmost respect for the other world that Ozarkers specifically, but a lot of people across different folk cultures have this utmost respect. And that respect goes back to that need for survival. You don't want to risk any aspect of your life going wrong. And so, by having this respect, not just for nature, but for the unseen aspects of nature, you are able to then, ensure your survival. So to go back to the little people, the little people are said to rule over certain aspects of nature, certain land features, specifically things like waterfalls, natural springs, old trees. If you're going through the woods and there's a big boulder and no other rocks around it, that's a place that the little people would dwell in. And so these areas were protected, fiercely protected. I've met farmers who refuse to cut lone trees down in their fields because those single solitary trees and fields are sometimes believed to be homes of the little people. So there's this very complex underbelly that unfortunately we don't get to see a lot of times because it's such a secretive culture. If there's this famous saying that Vance Randolph collected. He named one of his books after it, but it's "We always lie to strangers." And so it's this idea that unless you get to know us, we may not talk about everything, because there is that. It's not being it's not being I don't know, stingy or rude or unfriendly or anything like that. It's none of that. It's utmost respect. And that respect goes very deep, and it's connected back to that sense for that need for survival.
That cracks me up, that what you just said. I have driven by so many fields in the South, big, giant, cornfields and whatnot, and I've noticed this, Brandon. I've seen these lone trees that stand in the fields. Maybe it's for a different reason, but maybe it's something a different belief. Who knows? But I remember I've seen this a handful of times, and I've looked out the car window and said, "Got this huge field.
Yeah, why don't you just cut the tree down?
Why don't you just cut the tree down?
There?
Yeah, and plant there over that too." And now I understand that there may be a reason for that.
Oh yeah, I can't speak for everywhere, but in the Ozarks, farmers will give a lot of very creative excuses for leaving stuff like that behind. But if you dig a little deeper, a lot of it is connected to, they may not call them the little people. Some people, who have connections back to Ireland, things like that, they'll just say fairies. Or sometimes, it's certain land spirits, things like that. But a lot of times that is at the heart of that belief, even though on the outside, I've talked to lots of farmers who at first would say, "Oh, well, I left that oak tree out there so that when, we're working, we have a place to picnic. We have a place to sit under and get some shade while we're working in the field." And that makes sense.
That makes sense, yeah.
Of course, that makes sense. I knew it was wrong. I knew that wasn't the actual belief. And so, in most cases, pressing a little bit more, then they might say, "Well, somebody told me that it might be bad luck to cut down a tree like that." And so, Ozarkers are sometimes tough nuts to crack, and a lot of it is because of the culture. If they don't know you, if you're not from where they're from, we always lie to strangers at that point.
Even here in Michigan, where we're at, I just thought about this too. There's a trail I like to hike, and I've taken a picture of this tree several times on my hikes out there. And it's another giant field, and this is more towards the edge of the field, but it's still in where everything is being planted at, right? And there's this old tree, And I've watched this tree literally decay over the last 10, 15 years to the point where it's falling apart now. It's just a dead tree, basically. But they don't cut it down. And I mean, again, I'm not saying it's, and we're way over here in Michigan. So I'm not saying it's the same thing. But you mentioned that really puts a hook in me because I've seen this a handful of times now. And I wonder if I want to grab these farmers up now.
So, I mean, these beliefs about land spirits are cross-cultural. I know, I do a lot of research in other sort of areas just to connect certain practices across folk traditions back to the Ozarks, things like that. And so Scandinavia has a ton of these beliefs about land spirits and hidden folk in Iceland. And so, yeah, they inhabit trees, they inhabit rocks. It's bad luck to cut them down. It's bad luck to pull them up, things like that. So, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all if these folk beliefs had, different iterations.
People move. People move. Sometimes they move away from places, so and they may take those ideas with them. That's why you may see them further down south, or you may see them even here in Michigan. It's a fascinating idea. I'm sorry to keep grappling onto this.
I feel like our apple tree in back, that's like almost like 100 years old. Like, what? That tree's like 90 years old?
How do you know that?
Because I looked it up on the internet.
I'm not saying it's the same thing. What?
Is
there a page? There's a fan page
God.
for our apple tree, apparently, on the internet.
I looked how to measure the age of your tree based on circumference, and and that's about the age of that tree.
We're going to argue about this after the show.
Okay.
Because that don't make a whole lot of sense.
That's how old it is. But I go out there and like I give it hugs sometimes.
Oh, it's a cool tree.
Because I'm just like, I just love you. Sometimes too, it's like there's just something about those big old trees.
I think
it doesn't always maybe have something to do with your, your culture or anything, but at least
I
maybe
think the idea in nature, though, all over the world, and
respect for them.
Obviously, with Ozarkers, nature is very important too. If we haven't already illustrated that, right? And I think the idea of nature, it crosses all cultures and ideas and beliefs. All cultures on this planet have some tie to nature. All cultures, I think, have a lot of respect for nature also. It's something that draws us back. I think that's one of the things that, and I'm not going to go on some soapbox rant, but I think we're forgetting a lot of that stuff now in our sophisticated societies we have now. Is just that's going back to what we said before, Brandon, simplifying things to a certain degree, right? I know, and it's a funny thing too with the younger, those damn kids, the younger culture. But I do see this because, I was having this conversation with somebody recently, and that has always been this trope with it's the Generation X or the millennials, right? I'm far from a millennial. But all they do is sit on their computers all day long and they play video games and they do nothing. However, I look around and I see so many young people at parks. They're out running, they're exercising, they're doing stuff. They're doing simple things, right? And it seems like the more I look around, the younger culture that I see, they're younger than me at least, they are tied to nature more. I see them filling parks whenever I go out for my hikes and stuff like that. So I think maybe the world is going, and this is just ideas I'm throwing out there, that maybe with all this technical sophistication we have, it has amplified the fact that we as a society really should step it back a little bit and get things simple, right? The hard drive to get off fossil fuels and things like that. It's been more aggressive now than I've ever seen to just get us off fossil fuels and things like that. So it seems like maybe we may be simplifying things to a certain degree. We're sophisticated still, obviously, and I guess sophisticated in our terms. But maybe the younger generation is doing some cool stuff like that, which I think is fantastic. And I see it personally. I see it every day. And I think that's a cool thing. That was just an observation. I had to throw that out there.
No, I mean, I think you're exactly right with that. But I think at least for I think folk culture is so often tied to nature because going back to that idea of survival. And I think that need for nature has fallen away, and that has caused a lot of the problems that we have. If you are close to nature, you're less likely to destroy nature because destroying nature, you're very intimately tied to it, and you can actively see by plugging up this natural spring, in the drought, I'm not going to have any water, so and a lot of folk beliefs around land spirits and things like that have grown up as ways of, naturally, within the community and culture, protecting these sort of sacred sites. I think, to go back to the generational thing, at least in the Ozarks, there's been at least a couple of sort of lost generations. My parents, so I'm a millennial. I'm 33.
I'm glad I didn't beat up on the millennials tonight. Thank goodness.
Yeah. Well, so I see my grandparents, of course, knew more than my parents. My great grandparents, I know for a fact, knew more than my grandparents about sort of folk practices and cultural things. At least with my grandparents and my parents' generation, there was a big push to move away from the hillbilly stereotype.
Yeah.
But what I see with my generation and younger generations is that we're coming back to this sort of folk revival across the board. So it's not just Ozarks, but sort of in America, we're coming back to this, time when people are interested in folk crafts, folk cultures, things like that, food ways. And so a lot of the people that come to my workshops and classes, a lot of people that read my books are millennials. They're Gen Z. They're people who grew up with these beliefs, but they are a part of these lost generations who are now really wanting to reclaim and revitalize their own culture. I don't know how many people I've talked to around my age, millennials, who have come up and said, thank you. I feel validated as an Ozarker because of this book. I never knew that this was a part of my heritage or my culture.
And I think that happens a lot. You mentioned earlier on in the talk about growing up and not feeling part of any culture until you actively started to learn about it. And I think I felt the same way here in Michigan. Like, we don't live in the North. We're not Northerners. Like, those kids, Canadians. Like, there's like a lot of stuff like that is around you that you just go, meh. And then once you finally start getting involved in your local history and your family and your genealogy and all that kind of stuff, it all just sort of comes to life in front of you, and you're like, oh my God. Or like you even said,
that happened here? That happens here?
Right.
What's going on?
Yeah, like all the cool history that's around you, and how you had mentioned certain words that you just thought were ignorant actually go back to something else, and then they don't seem so ignorant anymore. And
right.
Yeah, so I love the fact that younger people are just, I think it's happened to every generation. There's been people that have wanted to reconnect with their roots and where they came from. I want to get into some paranormal stuff because we still have these questions that I want to
this
attack.
is one of those topics I
There's
can
so much.
feel it.
There's so much. I knew we were going to go all over the place. And like we could probably have Brandon come back because there's other aspects of this book, like with the healing part of things, like the medicinal stuff, plants. It's but there's a question here: how have Ozarkers traditionally approached ghosts and spirits of the dead, especially with this stigma of like trying to walk this fine line of like, we don't.
Well, we've already discussed.
We're not necromancers. We don't dabble in witchcraft. We don't talk to the dead. It's like, how did they view that?
So as with most aspects of Ozark folkways, it's very complicated because there's the surface level, and then there's all of this stuff that's kind of underneath that. Surface level, most Ozarkers all the way back, again, talking, before the 60s, were from a very specific branch of Christianity, Protestant Christianity. There were isolated Catholic groups around, but even amongst the Protestants, they were seen as backward and superstitious and all of this other stuff. So as far as this like sort of cultural connection to the dead goes, outwardly, you live, you die, you go to heaven or hell. That's, what's preached from the pulpits and all this other stuff. But underneath that, there is so much more. There's so much more to explore. There are folk beliefs that I've collected where people believe in, reincarnation. They believe that spirits of the dead come back as omen bringers, or in Ozarks, they're called tokens. So tokens are signs that you see in the world, these natural signs that can point to danger, can point to, there's a belief that if you see certain types of butterflies, that's spirits of the dead coming back to let you know that they love you. There's a folk belief that if a red bird, we have these cardinals down here, but a red bird taps at your window, it's a token. It's a sign from one of your dead relatives that danger is on its way. And in some cases, the sign is that you are quickly going to join them in the afterlife.
Ooh.
So there's all of these tokens, or what people have called superstitions, that really superstition has been used as a simplifying word for so long. Oh, it's just a superstition. We don't know where it came from. It's just one of those things. But when you start looking at these signs, these tokens, they all connect back to this sense that the other world is ever present around us. There's this idea, as far as Ozark cosmology goes, which is just like the fancy word that I like using all the time, cosmology, that no Ozarker would ever use. But so as a part of Ozark cosmology, there's the individual, there's the world that we see around us, but then there's this other world, this mirror world to our own, and that is where spirits of the departed live, angels, but also the spirits that people have called devils, demons, that we might call the little people, or land spirits, things like that. They all live in this other world, and normally, on a day-to-day basis, we can't see that other world, apart from tokens, signs from the other world that sort of leak into our own, and at certain times of the year. So traditional Ozarkers have this connection to Halloween, that goes back to Celtic folk belief and things like that. At Halloween, the dead are said to be able to wander around. The veil between worlds is thin, things like that. There's a lot of spirit activity, a lot of activity from the little people, things like that. So there are these folk beliefs as well. But on a day-to-day basis, people can't contact that other world, but healers can. So there's this idea that somebody who is born with the gift, or born with the power, somebody that has this sort of inborn quality about them that will lean them towards the path of a healer, or sometimes they may reject it altogether. But this gift is sometimes called like a second sight. Sometimes it's people refer to it as having one foot in this world, one foot in the other. There's this idea that because of this inborn gift, certain people have a natural inclination to see that other world. And so in a lot of cases, people are born with the gift, but in other cases, people find the gift. People buy the gift from the little people. They engage in these sort of exchanges of tasks or promises for the power, things like that. And so there's this idea that today, if you know anything about modern witchcraft traditions, things like that, in a lot of cases, there's this idea that everybody can be a witch. All you need is, the intention and the right tools, and you can be a witch.
Right.
And that's not the case in Ozark traditional belief. And traditional folk belief, the idea was that it was it was a tangible power. It was something you had to be born with. It was something that you could be gifted, something that you could find, you could buy, you could barter for, you could steal in some cases. But it was very tangible. It was almost like, the major image that I love using for the power is a pitcher, like a tea pitcher, full of water. And you are born with a certain amount of water in this pitcher. Sometimes you don't have any, sometimes you have a lot, but you have this tea pitcher full of water, and you can add to it. You can have somebody gift you power, and they will pour some water into your pitcher, but it's very tangible, so it can be lost as well. And so certain practices, rituals, things like that, if too many people see what you're doing or hear the words that you're saying, you are pouring water out of your pitcher. And so healers typically, when they are wanting to retire, they will find an apprentice or somebody in their family that has certain signs or tokens about them, to certain leanings towards the power, and they will just all at once give away everything. So they'll fill up their apprentice's pitcher with this water completely, and they'll be done. They won't have any left for themselves. And so this connection to the other world is kind of breached with these healers. And in some ways, that is a way for ordinary people to also experience that. A lot of times healers are invited to funerals, things like that, to lay the spirit of the dead, or make sure that they are put to rest. And there's some old traditions surrounding that. A lot of times they were brought to wakes and given as much food as they wanted in order to just be there and make sure that the spirit didn't come back to haunt the family, or didn't roam around. And in a lot of cases, like we were talking about earlier, none of this was spoken about. None of this was spoken about, except on a very sort of surface level. So you might have somebody in the community that knows things, as they say. You invite them to the funeral. You don't know what they're doing. They're not going to tell you what they're doing. They're just there to eat. They're just there to pay their respects. But underneath all of that is this really complicated process of, their interaction with the spirits of the dead and the ghosts and the family and stuff like that. But no one would ever say anything lest they tempt fate and risk, something bad happening.
That whole kind of secrecy part of it seems to be more unique to, maybe I'm wrong on this, but is it more unique, like with all of the other folk magic practices you've probably looked into, like we mentioned hoodoo or powwows, was this secrecy element a little stronger in Ozark folk magic compared to others that you've studied?
Well, I think that's kind of a cross-cultural aspect of folk culture in general, is the need for secrecy, because it goes back to that sort of survival tendency. I think that traditions that have been written about more have less of that sort of secrecy as a part of their modern culture, I guess. The thing with the Ozarks is that no one's really written about this since Vance Randolph. Apart from historical stuff. I will say, though, nowadays the modern Ozark healers that I've met and in my own practice, secrecy is not as much of a sort of taboo. And so in the old days, you had very strict rules about how you could pass down the power, who you could pass it to. All of this other stuff. And in most cases, healers don't really abide by stuff like that anymore. The reason for that is that most of the healers that I've met have no one in their lives that were interested. So they would literally give their gift away to anybody that was interested. And that's a really sad fact. In a lot of cases, their grandkids have moved away. Their kids don't want to be a part of the superstitions, and so they may have a lot of knowledge, they may have a lot of power, but they don't have anywhere to put it. They don't have anyone to give it to. So it's sort of opened up a lot of the practices these days. You just kind of have to sometimes build up trust with a person, and then they will a lot of times give you a lot of stuff. But in the old days, that was not a thing that was done. Secrecy for healers was necessary to keep practice, traditional or pure, whatever that means, but also it was for self-survival as well. If you pass around this stuff to too many people, then you risk people calling you a witch or all this other stuff. But today, a lot of that's changed, just mostly out of necessity for passing down the practice.
Well, I think just a quick note on that. I think the paranormal in general, across the board, across the entire United States, maybe the world. It's a lot different. It is a lot less taboo. People are talking about this stuff a lot more nowadays. So I think it's just a part of the wider culture we have now, where these ideas are just out there a lot more, and people are more accepting of them, I think.
No, absolutely. I think because of internet culture and all of this other stuff, I think we're exposed to a lot more information, and that makes us a little bit more likely to share information as well. Um, but so that's been one of the interesting areas for my research, is finding out how these sort of folk practices and beliefs have changed into the modern world, especially with exposure to lots of different traditions of witchcraft, New Age traditions, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is and what I found is that we've just changed how we view tradition. It's still traditional. It's still Ozark. These are still Ozark practitioners.
Yes,
But
of course.
and Ozarkers, going back to that idea of resilience, Ozarkers have always been open to bringing in other things. There was a healer that I met who he said, if it works, it works.
Yeah.
And so, this has always kind of been a part of the tradition. It's just nowadays we have a lot more, there's a lot bigger well to draw from. And you see that in a lot of the modern practices and beliefs.
Now, you yourself discovered while you've been on this path that you have gifts. What did you discover about yourself that you're able to do, and how did that kind of unfold in your life?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always kind of had a little bit of a, I guess, what the old timers would call it, an inclination or a token, towards certain, the trees and nature. I would, be out in the woods a lot, and I would see fairies, and I would see, spirits and things like that. But it was just kind of always a part of, what I was considered a part of childhood and stuff like that. So I started off with the Ozark stuff more as a researcher, as a folklorist, with kind of, my love of the weird stuff still in the back of my mind. But I was talking to a healer that I had met, and I was kind of presenting the book to her, the first form of the book, which looked nothing like the one I published. So I was talking to her about it and everything, and she just stopped me and she said, you're a part of this story too. And up until that point, I hadn't viewed myself as an informant. I hadn't viewed myself as an Ozarker who knew things. So it took her, kind of stopping me in my tracks and saying, no, you have the gift as well. You need to write from your perspective. You need to connect to this work as a healer. And so it immediately changed the way I went about collecting things. I wasn't collecting things as a researcher. I stopped taking a recorder with me. I stopped taking pads of paper and stuff like that, and I just started absorbing everything that I could. Traditionally, folk practices magic and healing practices have always been passed down orally. There used to be a very big taboo against writing things down, writing down charms, verbal charms and spells and things. It was said it killed the magic. And I don't have the same sort of belief, just from personal experience, but that was a big part of this sort of second stage of my work, was trying to work in that old way, trying to absorb what I could from storytellers and healers orally. So that I could retain information. And, in Ozark folk belief, having the gift doesn't automatically make you, a healer or a witch. It's all about accepting the gift and embracing it and cultivating it. It's like being born with a seed inside of you, or a pitcher of water. You've got to cultivate the seed to let it grow. You've got to, do something with the water, or else it'll just sit there. And so for me, personally, in my practice, I started off doing mostly herbal work, plant work, stuff like that. But my relationship to plants quickly transformed into a relationship to spirits. So relationship to spirits of the land, the little people, relationship to ghosts, things like that. So I consider myself a healer and a spirit medium. I work with spirits in a little bit different way than other mediums, but I typically in my work, I do rituals. So if someone wants a traditional house blessing, I have Ozark house blessings. I make charm bags, things like that. So I work with traditional Ozark sort of folk rituals, things like that. But then I also have this sort of ever evolving connection to the world of spirits that influences a lot of the healing work that I do.
How do you see spirits? Like, how do they manifest for you?
Well, so for me, it's a lot of feeling and a lot of sort of auditory experience. Like I said, I kind of have a different relationship to spirits. I can sense ghosts and things like that. They don't always appear physically. Sometimes it comes as like random thoughts and memories that aren't my own. Sort of, thinking about walking down the trail or whatever, and then all of a sudden, this Civil War soldiers memories pass through,
Sure, yeah.
and I kind of, I learned to see those moments as influences from the spirit world, not as just random thoughts. And so I'm at a point right now where I'm much more comfortable exploring those sorts of tangents and things. But typically, I guess this is kind of a traditional way to work, but not a way that people have worked in a long time. So I have certain spirits that weren't necessarily spirits of the dead, but they are spirits that I have encountered in nature that sort of are just a part of my work. They're more like tools at that point. There are spirits that do certain things for me. There are spirits that do certain things in my work. And so those are kind of always a part of my club. They're always hanging out in my clubhouse for, whenever I need to do work. And a lot of them are spirits of the land.
Yeah.
So these sort of nature spirits that manifest. A lot of them are also ancestral spirits, and spirits of other workers, things like that. So yeah, like a lot of things within the Ozarks, the outward manifestation is often deceptive. It's often overly simplistic, but it hides a very complex system behind it.
It makes me think about this idea of, because we all have thoughts, and sometimes I feel like I'm attacked by thoughts at times. I'm attacked by thoughts that I don't want to experience. I don't want to have those thoughts. Sometimes they're not good thoughts, right? A lot of times they're good thoughts though too. And I never really thought about it that way, that maybe they could be this manifestation, that these could be spirits talking to us, not just our brain going in different directions chemically, right? It could be transmissions we're receiving. And it ties into other ideas I've heard about how our minds are just basically one small node of a larger supercomputer, for lack of a better term, that's out there that we're plugged into, basically. That could be a spiritual element too. And that just makes me think about that idea that maybe some random thoughts that come through your head while you're doing something, they're not just your body or your mind responding to something. They could be coming from somewhere else. And we're all experiencing that all the time, maybe.
Yeah. And I think, probably everybody experiences that, like you were saying, to some degree.
Yeah.
And then I think that, the only difference kind of with what I do is maybe, the things that I experience are amped up just a little bit.
I think there's people that are way more tuned into this, obviously, like yourself than others. I know I make the joke all the time that I am as sensitive as the water bottle I'm drinking right now. I mean, I really don't feel like I have that, but hearing this, it's just another idea. Like maybe I am a bit more sensitive than I give myself credit for.
Well, and I think people can learn it, and like Brandon said, you can fill your pitcher up.
You can grow that seed.
Add that water.
Yeah.
And some people are always going to be better at it than others. Like some people can just play basketball better than others. Like I'm not going to beat Shaq at a baseball game. Or I'm not baseball, but basketball. It's not going to happen.
Yeah, and that's just a fact.
Yeah.
That some people will they will excel at this than other people.
Biology and genetics.
Brandon, want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. This has been fantastic.
And where can people
let's talk
find
about the
you?
book for a second. Yeah.
And find your book and all that good stuff.
Yeah, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so the book is available pretty much any online bookseller. It's on Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all those good places. And also, a bunch of random shops around the country are now, sending me messages saying, hey, we're selling your book now. So it could be in your own local area. But you can also find me. My website is ozarkhealing.com. I also have a Facebook page, Ozark Healing Traditions, and an Instagram account at Ozark Healing Traditions.
We'll make sure we link all that stuff up on that when we post the show up. We'll make sure we have all those links available to everybody too.
Yeah, so this has been a huge part of my life, and I'm so excited to be able to share it with people. Since doing the pandemic and all of that, I've started doing virtual classes instead of just the in-person classes. So wherever you are, you may be able to join up one of my classes. I post all of that stuff on my website.
Excellent, cool. Can't thank you enough again, Brandon, and we'd love to have you back on again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. We can talk about more little people and weird shit.
Ghostly talk.
Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all those good places, and also a bunch of
The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show with me, Charles Christian. We've another big interview this week, so rather than me chew the fat, we're going to jump straight in. My guest is best-selling author Freddie Silva, who is here to treat us to 1 hour of high strangeness as we discuss ancient mysteries, alternative history, sacred sites, ley lines, and crop circles. Freddie is the author of 6 books, including First Templar Nation, about the Knights Templar, The Missing Lands, Uncovering Earth's Pre-Flood Civilizations, and The Divine Blueprint, providing an account of the origin of ancient temples and the role played by sacred sites in raising human consciousness. Freddie has been described as the best metaphysical speaker in the world right now. Good to be speaking to you. The first question we always like to ask is, what got you interested in writing about and researching these types of topics?
Probably because I was drawing pyramids when I was 3. I think I think we're all hardwired to do something in life. We don't really know it, or at least most of us are not aware of what we're here to do until much later. Some of them are very lucky and they find it pretty early on, but I never really fit into the modern world. I still don't, and I sort of got sidetracked into going into graphic design. I tried to be a rock and roll star in London and America. Didn't quite succeed. And I had the hair back then as well. And then I became one of the youngest creative directors in advertising in London, moved to the States. And slowly I realized that my passion was elsewhere. I kept getting fired for having a conscience, and I figured I'm not really changing the world. So it was those moments during being laid off that I picked all the books that I'd accumulated in my library, and I realized, this is what I want to do. I want to go and play with pyramids and Stonehenge and all kinds of things, and to find out what this is all really about. I've never really accepted the official version of things. Something just doesn't quite sit right. And it was that inquiring of mine that just led me to where I am today. But I really got through it through studying crop circles. And incredibly, my first book released ends up being an international bestseller. And it still is. I'm very proud of that. So the segue really was to find out that crop circles are done exactly in the same way as pyramids and Stonehenge and every other sacred site in the world. So it has been a very rich sort of research project for 25 years.
Yeah, the first book, was that Secrets of the Fields?
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. So, again, I know a lot of people have an interest in, and I'm using the term broadly, the paranormal as opposed to the, if you like, the mundane. But yours is got a very strong mathematical, geometrical angle to it. It's one of those things traditionally, isn't it? If you like the arts at school, then you usually hate maths and geometry in particular. But you're going there with the pyramids, the crop circles, the sacred geometry of sacred sites. You're also interested in the Templars. And again, there's a whole field of Templar geometry that I've seen reference to. What is the attraction of it? Is it the fact that all these lines they aren't random, they seem to mean something? Where did that angle come from?
Well, actually, it was what I try to do is bring in a certain science to underpin all the metaphysical work that I tend to get involved writing about, because a lot of it is involved with metaphysics. It's to do with the alteration of the human spirit and the improvement of the human condition. And these things are thousands of years old. And one of the things that I really aim to do is to try to bring people who might be on the fence or even skeptical to take a look at this. Otherwise, I'm just preaching to the choir and nothing's really being moved. I should sort of point out, I actually hate mathematics. I don't see numbers easily. I have to actually draw pictures to understand numbers. And I force myself to understand what the ancients were doing. And it turns out that in the 60s, the Russians were looking at exactly the same stuff. So to bring these two worlds together, when the Russians were hard up for money and the wall was still up, they would go to Gothic cathedrals and they would try to understand why is it that people are having unusual spiritual experiences. And I don't mean religious experiences, sort of metaphysical experiences in these buildings, but they're also being healed. Is it something to do with the positioning and the arrangement of things inside the building? Well, it turns out they were absolutely right. That shape has a profound effect on the human body. Just like when you go into certain pyramids, they affect you different to other pyramids. And yet they're all pyramids. They all look the same, and yet they're not. The angles of the slopes are different. And that's the point of the matter, that the shape has a profound effect on the human body and its state of awareness. If you actually look at the human DNA under the microscope, you see that we're all made of a bunch of sugar crystals and amino acids, and they're all geometrically aligned. So, like it or not, we are drawn to geometric order, and it's that geometry, the angles, that move atoms and molecules in a certain way, which then have a corresponding effect on people, which is why you can go into two near identical temples and they'll have a completely different effect on you for that very reason. So that's why it got me interested into understanding what these people were doing. And it turns out there was a whole science behind it.
No, I'm taking your point because, yes, I have observed that you can go into some places, an old church, and if you like, and it just appears to be completely soulless, for want of a better word, and you can go into others and there is just something moving about it, some element, something otherworldly about it.
Yeah, and if you go to the oldest ones, the Celtic Christian church especially, and of course the Gothic cathedrals, the one thing that they share in common is that they're all built upon original temples, and every one of those temples all around the world, without exception, are built upon the crossing points of the Earth's telluric currents, which NASA only picked up only about 30 years ago. In fact, they even sent a press release out about it, saying that they're actually interested in looking at these geomagnetic anomalies and also these electromagnetic serpents, for lack of a better word, that crisscross the land everywhere. I mean, I'm sitting on one right now where I'm speaking to you from in Maine. And in fact, it's the only place where I can actually do my work and have my desk. So there's the connection. The ancient people were very much more connected to the lands. They could understand the subtlety of things, and they understood that sitting in certain locations, that something felt different, and that's where they felt, okay, this is where we're much more connected to the spirit of nature, what they called God back then. God was not a guy with a beard sitting on a throne. It was a spirit that surrounds every living organism. So for them to be in these hotspots where the Earth's telluric currents congregate was for them an easy way to, disappear from this mortal coil for a few minutes or a few days. It became part of the fundamental concept of initiation. And they would connect with a kind of astral reference library. And then they would come back renewed, rejuvenated, and they would go on their daily lives much better than they were before. And as we stopped being able to see these things with the movement into industrialization, it turns out that the ancients thought, well, humans are not going to do well out of this because they're becoming disconnected with the source. Let's build temples on top of these energy lines so we know where they can find these hotspots. And that's what the culture of temple making really developed from. It was from the understanding and harnessing these invisible forces which are around us every single day. We tend to ignore them at our peril, but now we know where to go find them, which is why there's a sudden drive around the world. And I've seen it in the last 20 years of people who really feel the need to go to these ancient places. And I'm not talking about mass tourism either. People really feel that there's a connection that they're missing, and they can find that connection in these temples.
And these telluric lines, are they the same as ley lines? Or are they different aspects of the same thing?
I get asked that a lot. I don't know how the two ever became connected. Ley lines was really a term that was coined by Alfred Watkins when he was looking at geometric alignments on the landscape in Herefordshire and then throughout the whole of the British Isles. And he was absolutely correct. There was an ancient system of metrology where the sites were connected by geometric alignment, especially if they held some kind of common point between them. You can't just draw the lines willy-nilly. That would be easy to do. It would be like connecting post boxes and figuring out, oh, there's a pattern here. No, they have to actually be part of the same function, or the same age, or the same shape in order to make the connections. But the different point is that the energy lines are something completely different. They are literally serpents, invisible serpents that move all around the Earth. And sometimes where they interact, they create these eddies called blind springs, and that's where you'll find the world's biggest temples. So they're kind of interconnected, but they're not quite the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, is that really because Watkins' ideas got taken over by John Michel's view over Atlantis, which does tend to call them energy lines and dragon lines, and sort of blurs the difference?
No, I think people just misunderstood what he was writing. I mean, he was actually one of my tutors, I guess. Incredible man. I think people just misunderstood the two, and somehow they got the two together without realizing that, first of all, you have the energy currents, the telluric currents, and then you put structures on top of them. And sometimes, if you find, let's say, 3 or more in a vicinity that are connected by age, shape, or form or function, if you connect them, it turns out that they actually form a straight line. So there's sometimes the two overlap, but they're not the same thing. I think we just misunderstood what he was trying to describe.
What about, because we mentioned this at the very outset, crop circles? That we're heading towards the summer season, and there'll be more crop circle sightings. Now, I recall seeing stories about crop circles when I was a kid growing up in the 50s, and certainly the literature has tales of crop cycles going back to certainly the 17th century, if not earlier. But it all rather got hijacked again in the, 20 years ago, when it was all said it was all done by hoaxes and it was all lack of myth. What's your take on crop circles?
Oh, they've been around quite a long time. In fact, we gathered eyewitness accounts going back to the 1860s with policemen and postmen and farmers. They're quite fascinating. And they usually were accompanied by the same reports that there's usually a tube coming out of the sky in bright daylight. And this is from farmers, by the way, who are not into any of this stuff.
Yes.
So when they talk like this, you've got to be paying attention. And one of them from Sussex in 1963, if I remember the date correctly, or 23, I can't remember. He talks about how he was out in the barley field. It was a beautiful summer's day, and he said he called it a tube, just rotated out of the sky from the clouds, stopped a little bit short of the head of the crop, rotated it for about 15 seconds, which is the standard time I hear in every single account, regardless how big the design is, and then boom, it just flattens. And in one case, there's a farmer also in Hampshire that talks about rain actually bouncing off this invisible tube. So he was looking at a kind of an eddy, a vortex that was coming out of the sky, and perhaps even more. But the whole thing has been, you're right, it has been completely hijacked, not by skeptics, but by people within MI6. And this is where the conspiracy theorists can start listening in, because the conspiracy is actually quite true. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. We actually traced the stories of the hoaxers, who originally were Doug and Dave, back to MI6 as part of this information campaign, while the military and the government in Britain kept the phenomenon under watch. Well, if it was a big hoax, then why would they actually using our taxpayers' money to keep the whole crop circle phenomenon under observation? It didn't make any sense. And anybody who looks for the minutes of Parliament can actually look into this. So it turns out that they knew, the military also knew that there was a real phenomenon going on. The farmers always complained that the first sign of crop circles at 3 in the morning on their land were immediately preceded by military helicopters. We're bristling with high precision equipment, taking photographs, shooting videos, to which as many of the farmers would respond by going out and shooting guns into the air and getting rid of them. I love British farmers. They've got a sense of drama. The whole thing really, I mean, and to this very day, we cannot reproduce as humans the real physiognomy of the crop circles, the lack of damage, the bend 2 inches above the soil, the changes in the center of the structure of the plants. All that cannot be done by people. And I've seen my fair share of people trying to make crop circles, and they're getting better at it, but they can't reproduce them. That's the big thing. And again, it goes back to the connection to ancient sacred sites, and they also are appearing on the Earth's telluric currents, and they're also influencing the shape and structure of the energy of the local sacred site.